Good afternoon, friends. Here we are, Gord's Poetry Show 87, Part 2. And Part 1, we discussed the history and legendary status of Rampike. And on this section, Part 2, we're going to let Karl talk and read from his current work. And we'll discuss the Razor's Edge stories, which I'm totally fascinated with. Been reading it on and off for the last month, and it's one of those in-depth texts that rewards repeated readings. There's always more than you thought you read before. Anyway, here we are. And I think Karl would like to talk about his new publication and maybe read from it.
Well, if you like, yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. I mean, this is the most recent one, The Razor's Edge. But I also had this come out not long ago. It's called Eco Blues, A Tale in Three Parts. And it was published by Above Ground Press in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can say a little bit about both of them.
Please do.
Okay. So I'll read a little bit from the first part of the chapbook. It's part 1 from Another Cafe Americano Dream. So you're working at the coffee shop at the corner of University and somewhere, and you're thinking you should have stayed in school. There's an unkempt, hairy person trying to make small talk from across the counter, and you know they're trying to weasel you into a date. You're desperate for an intrusion, and as luck would have it, the androgynous advertisement flyer person bursts in, black lipstick, strategically zippered, ripped black clothing, augmented delicately or discreetly with fine link silver chains, strategically disheveled black hair covering various piercings. They plunk the weekly flyers on the counter. You notice the flyers have a prominent green notice saying printed on 70-pound uncoated 100% recycled paper. To avoid the teetotaler, you grab a flyer and begin reading. The flyer says, "You can change your life. Count Alessandro de Cagliostro has discovered a profound secret. Yes, for 3 easy-to-manage payments of only $19.99, learn how you can rewrite the script of your life. Transform your humdrum existence into a dizzying buzz of delight. How? Simply apply the rhetorical techniques of great fiction to your daily activities. Count Cagliostro will show you how. Just by reading this, your transformative journey has begun." So the stories in this little collection talk about ecology and how a person can transform their life through language. And so language is the tricky part. Yeah. So I often pay attention to words and linguistics and stuff like that. And anyway.
Transform your life through language.
Yeah.
I like it.
So they want to rewrite their life. So it borrows a little bit from people like Italo Calvino, who wrote about self-reflexivity in writing and how it can change the narrative direction and stuff like that.
I remember reading one of his books years ago, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller.
Yeah, he's brilliant, yeah. He's one of my heroes, yeah.
Is he? Really?
I like his stuff, and I liked his short stories too. But I'm a short story writer. I primarily write short fiction.
Yes.
Although I had some poetry accepted recently that I thought was prose, but it was published in the TypeScript magazine in the United States.
Yes.
It was titled Father's Day, and it was, I thought, a story, but it got selected for Best Canadian Poetry of 2022.
Really?
To be published in an anthology very soon, later this year. And so I guess it's a prose poem, and so I wasn't sure. I didn't argue with them because I said, "Hey, it's a prize. I want a prize. Hooray!" And so it occurred to me that maybe it was a prose poem, and Yeah, so like that's coming out for pretty soon from Biblioasis Press, which happens to be in Windsor, where I'm located right now.
I think they've started advertising it on Facebook. I'm sure I saw one just the other day.
Oh, could be, yeah.
And I'll likely wind up reviewing it because I've read those anthologies before.
Well, you'll run across me one more time there.
Well, congratulations! That's great.
Thanks, yeah.
For somebody that doesn't normally write poetry. That's
an
achievement.
Yeah.
Good for you. Prose poems are very interesting, Karl. Well, I'm fascinated with them. I see a lot of them around over the years, even old ones. Gertrude Stein years ago did something called Gnarly Buttons. Great prose poems.
Yes.
Really enjoyed those.
Tender Buttons, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Was it? I thought it was Gnarly Buttons, but maybe it was Tender Buttons.
They could be gnarly too.
And there's a whole history to prose poetry, but it's an interesting form, and I really like exploring it.
Well, I think good writing should have a poetic quality to it, and it should be resonating with a kind of musicality, which I think happens in some of the better authors' works. And so I think of people like Leonard Cohen, who wrote novels but also writes music. And I guess for myself, I could say that something like scintillating semantique is the thing that does the trick, but grandiloquent fecundity fills the ear most pleasantly. However, we all best accentuate when clearly we enunciate. Lecture, preach, pray, and teach. Fill the room up with your speech. Jibber jabber like a monkey. Talk the hind leg off a donkey. We've all heard some great orations, speakers, clever declarations, recitations, exhortations, wisely worded perorations. Only one thing you got to know, whether you come or whether you go, is language is as language does. There ain't no need to make a fuss, provided your vernacular is acoustically spectacular.
Very good. Very good. I didn't realize you were reading there until you got halfway into it.
I wasn't reading that. I was reciting it.
Oh, sorry, reciting.
I memorized that, yeah.
Oh, I see. It's not on the page in front of you?
No, it's not.
Oh, congratulations, even more so.
This cup is very large. It looks huge. Look at the size. In the picture, it looks so big.
It does.
It's actually a pretty big mug.
It is. It's.
But it looks as big as my head. Look at it.
I know.
I could fit my head into it.
We're going to bring his head out of this mug, just like a rabbit out of a hat. Yes. Oh, that's great. You were reciting from memory. That's something I've never been able to do. I can get about 3 lines out and then I forget the rest.
Oh, yeah.
I'm hopeless. And I always admire people that can pull that off because I can't. I'm certainly able to read any kind of poetry, but from memory, no. Well, not too good.
I always heard that when I was in Europe, I was promoting my magazine, and they would say, well, what are you doing here apart from promoting your magazine? I say, well, I'm also a writer. And they'd say, well, recite something. and they'd go, well, all the writers can recite something. And so I was stuck because I hadn't memorized any of my stuff. So since then, I've learned to memorize some of my writing. And I just do that now.
Well done. I can't do it. I can't pull it off.
It's hard.
I can give you like 3 or 4 lines of my favorite Dylan Thomas poem, but I can never give you the whole thing.
That's pretty good.
You know?
Yeah.
But
Dylan Thomas is great.
Yeah, and
one of my heroes.
Well, for sure. I mean, the inimitable Dylan, and you can't possibly write like him without sounding like him. So you just give it up right away.
Yeah.
You know? But yeah, a big influence on me when I was young. A big inspiration for sure. Yeah. And I mean, some of his early stuff is just out there. The famous poems that get recited by actors on television and stuff that you can understand, great. But the early ones, like the sonnet sequence in the 2nd or 3rd book, Alter Wise by Our Light. Now tell me what that's about. But I love reading it. It's a wonderful piece.
Well, whenever I write, I always try to inhabit a kind of musicality that writers like Dylan Thomas always had in their texts. And so I've always, I think it's partly because of my cultural background. I'm from the Baltic, and my background is actually Latvian. And they sing about just about everything in Latvia. They have something like 200,000 songs called Dinahs, which, not to be confused with the name, it's just how they call short songs. And they have songs for being born, dying, getting married, rites of passage, sexual liaisons, you name it, like whatever. So everything is about a song, or can be sung about. And so what I look for in my own writing is a kind of musicality, if I can find it. I guess it was B.P. Nichol. He was a well-known poet, of course, but he used to say, well, if you're not 100% sure about your writing, read it out loud. And what does it sound like?
Yes.
And I would read it out loud, and I'd go, not musical enough yet. So I would keep writing until it carried forward a kind of musicality to it. I wanted the sound quality to be in there.
Well, you speak of musicality, and that reminds me of a point I made with you before we started recording. The stories in The Razor's Edge are so they're woven in a way that themes recur in different guises, and themes from one story or images move into another piece of storytelling, and I found it to be symphonic in the depth of its weaving, symphonic in the sense of late 19th century symphonies like Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Saint-Saëns, where the weaving is very subtle and very complex, and you have to listen to the symphony 10, 15 times before you even get close to it. And I found your stories in The Razor's Edge here to be similar. I've read all of them twice, and when I was rereading one today, you get into a deeper level that you didn't notice before. And I think that's an amazing achievement. And would you care to comment on a little bit of how many drafts that you may have done in order to get that subtle interweaving?
Well, yeah, I would work on any given story maybe as many as 10 times. And I wanted, weaving is part of also my cultural background, as is music. And the intricacies of weaving are something that inhabit the culture that I come from. And so it was a natural thing for me to just weave stuff in that had a musical quality to it. And I wanted to get, when you say there was some repetition, I wanted echoes in the piece, because there's something in music called phrasing, and sometimes you can repeat phrases. And so I wanted to repeat a kind of musical phrase that would occur sometime later, and then it would kind of resonate with you, kind of like a glass or a porcelain jar. You click with your finger and it goes boom, and it vibrates, and then it would come back and vibrate again, and you'd go, oh, I've heard that somewhere before, and you realize it's in the same story or in another story that's in the same collection. And so I kind of did that on purpose. Yeah.
I see. Well, you did it very successfully as far as I'm concerned. And as I've said in my review and talking here, this is a book of narratives that rewards rereading. You get deeper and deeper into it all the time.
Well, thanks.
And it's a text that keeps on giving. And I found that earlier this afternoon. And many different types of stories, I might add. Karl goes from reminiscences of, I think, when you're about 4 years old, sitting with your best buddy in the garden watching traffic go by.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. We were thinking about how we were going to face death, because we were 4-year-olds and sitting on the front lawn, eating pink elephant popcorn, the kind with
Yes.
a little dinky prize inside.
Yes.
And you never knew what the prize was. It could be like a little whistle or a pair of dice or something like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
And we were contemplating what happened to kids who took off in the school bus.
Yes.
And we noticed that they would go to the school, but we didn't see them come back because our parents would call us in before 3:30 when the bus came back.
Yes.
And we had to go and do whatever else, our parents told us to do. And so we never saw the kids coming back. And we wondered, as 4-year-olds might, as to what happened to those kids. We speculated and we thought, well, maybe they got hauled away, because we had heard our parents talking about places like the Gulag and death camps in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union and places like that. And we thought, well, maybe this is the way they do things in Canada. And so, we didn't know. We just didn't know. And so we're thinking, well, next year is going to be my year to die. It was ridiculous, but yeah, it's true that we were little philosophers thinking about what might happen. Yeah.
Well, it was very convincing portrayal of early childhood. And then I'm looking, I can't remember the name of the story. I'm looking for it now, but it's the one you dedicated to Nicole Brassard.
Oh yes,
and it's very complex, subtle, postmodernist stuff.
Yeah.
And it's got a completely different world than the world of the children,
Right.
And again,
yeah.
when you're reminiscing about your mother's catering, that's with detailed descriptions of all the dishes that she would
food,
prepare.
Yeah, she was a caterer. Yeah,
weddings
she would
and
prepare
whatnot.
all kinds of food.
So that's what I'm sort of getting at, is the different types of stories that you don't see that repeated. You see a book of postmodern stories, that's what you get. And they're all, difficult and complex and challenging. And worthwhile, but you really have to focus on them. And these, they're all different. That's what fascinates me.
Well, that's what I was aiming for. Yeah, I wanted to cover a wide range, and a lot of people have said nice things about it so far. Like Nino Ricci has reviewed it. He won a couple of Governor General awards.
Sure, I remember.
But he said he liked the stories because he called each one a tour de force.
Yes.
And I suppose in some ways they are. And if you want to check out my website, it's www.jirgens.org, O-R-G, And I didn't know at the time that O-R-G stands for organization. And I was disorganized at the time I picked that title, so I had no idea that that's what it was for. Anyway, so I picked that as my, I should have gone .com or something. I didn't know.
Yes.
Anyhow, so we all thought when we were kids we were all going to die.
Really.
And that because it was around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
With Khrushchev putting nuclear missiles. It showed up in an X-Men movie too, I think. Khrushchev putting nuclear missiles into Cuba, or shipping them over to Cuba, and then the U.S. Resisting that under President Kennedy. And we would watch the Doomsday Clock on the editorial page of the Toronto Star coming 1 minute closer to midnight, and we knew that if it hit midnight, we would all be dying in a nuclear holocaust. And so we were horrified, we were just little kids. And then it didn't happen, and then later, so I talk about stuff like my mother's catering business, and I go through all the foods that she used to prepare, and I remembered many of them because I would have to work as an assistant to her catering, and so I would watch carefully what she prepared, and I would remember it all. Like, she was very ornate, and I got to sample a lot of free food. It was fun, I had a good time there. Yeah.
And I mean, look at the one story that reflects deeply on Anthony Bourdain.
Right, yeah.
That was pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That sounded like was it the actual details of one day in your life?
Well, the Anthony Bourdain story was about me getting a haircut, which is a riff on the title of the book, which is The Razor's Edge.
Yes.
And it was an outright steal from a novel by Somerset Maugham, in which he has a novel by the same title, and they made a couple of movies about it. The first one won a number of Oscars, and the second one also won some Oscars, but the second one starred Bill Murray as the protagonist, who is disenchanted with the world and is trying to find a kind of sense of self-peace or something like that. And he was criticized for his role in that part, and I thought he played it perfectly because
I did too. I loved it.
Yeah, he was the disenchanted young man who had given up on the methods of commercialism and stuff like that. And so I thought, yeah, okay, that's good too. The Nicole Broussard dedicated story was about me getting kicked out of an apartment. And I had by that time fallen in love with my appliances, including my fridge.
That's right, the appliance story. I remember it now.
Yeah, and I had fallen in love with them, and I thought, one day maybe I'll get new appliances that are I'll go to a used appliance store and I'll buy appliances just like the old ones. And I happened to have a photocopier, and so I was photocopying the appliance manuals, and I discovered that there was a section in the manual that described the sounds that you might not know about that would emanate from your refrigerator if it wasn't functioning properly, or even if it was functioning properly.
I hear you.
And so I had crazy dreams about that.
Oh, really?
And so I thought I'd write that in. So there was an acoustic level to that one too.
Right. Oh, there was. That's quite remarkable. And our fairly new fridge there, it's got a page telling you exactly what you just said. If it makes this noise, it's doing this. If it makes this noise, it's doing that.
Yeah.
And I was quite fascinated because I'd heard the noises but didn't know that they signified anything.
Well, I didn't either. When I found the manual, it blew my mind. And I went, okay, this has got to be in a story somewhere. And I said, who's going to deliver the story except me?
Right.
And then the reason I dedicated to Nicole Broussard, who I'm very impressed with as a writer of fiction, and I love her stuff. She's one of the strong Quebec fiction collective feminists, and she came and listened to me read that story while I was at Bookfest Windsor in the city of Windsor. I'm originally from Toronto, but she gave me a standing ovation on it. And I thought, well, okay, I'll just dedicate this story to her because she really appreciated what I was trying to do. I steal parts from Hamlet in that story too.
Oh, I noticed that.
I openly steal them because, and that fit in with the whole idea of photocopying the manual, because I was also copying Shakespeare and including his stuff in the story at the same time.
Yeah, I thought that worked very well. There was Ophelia and Hamlet references. Very good. Yeah. Really enjoyed that. Another theme I'd like to take up with you is your uncle, and who was cast into Stalin's Gulag, and his experiences there. Very grim, very ruthless, very cruel, and what we know from Solzhenitsyn and others, and other World War II memories, none of which are pleasant, as we know. But I wanted to throw a quote at you. Given that background, cultural background, family background, do you agree with James Joyce that history is a nightmare from which we are trying to awaken?
Yeah, I suppose that's true. That works for me. And the horror of what happened to my uncle came home because he would send actual letters to my family in Toronto that made their way over, and they were folded into triangles, because
Yes.
they didn't have paper. Like, so he would fold paper, and they had to beg for a stamp, and they were starving them to death. They were giving them what was called the Exquisite Diet, which was just a few grams less than a human body needs to survive.
Yes.
And the reason they were doing that in the Gulag of the Soviet Union, that Solzhenitsyn talks about, as we mentioned, was so that if they died, it would look like they died from kidney failure or liver failure or something else, or pneumonia.
Yes.
And it wouldn't look like they had been starved to death, because the Red Cross would sometimes come out and check them. And I had somebody that I knew who had survived there for 23 years, and he did it by eating things like bugs and stuff like that, because there was enough protein there, and you could trade stuff away, and he had to care. He was lucky because he was able to survive, because in a capricious moment, before he was sent over, the person that was removing the zippers and buttons from all of their clothing decided to let him keep a button on his trousers, which meant that he didn't have to use his hands to hold up the trousers all the time. So when he did hard labor, he was able to use both hands, which made him able to do more work, which meant that he was entitled to slightly more food. And so my uncle was not that lucky, and he died over there as a result. And so all I have left of him are the letters that he used to send us, begging for us to send him some non-perishable goods, such as rice or macaroni or something, because they had snow there and they could make water.
Yes.
But I don't think he ever got it, because he never acknowledged it. And I think that it went to feed the guards that were working in the Gulag, and so he never got any, and so that was the end of him, and he just died. So I was trying to work in the lighthearted stuff with the dark side of life, and I would just jump from one to the other.
Well, I think you did it quite successfully. I don't want to criticize it, but I just wanted to react to that Joyce quote, because it's one that permeates our culture, literary culture. Almost anyone can quote it. History is a nightmare from which we're trying to awaken. And I don't know if you saw the dark British comedy called The Death of Stalin.
I did. That's a fantastic movie. I love it.
When that son of a bitch died, I was just ready to cheer.
Yeah.
What a poor excuse for a human being that guy was. My God.
And the funny thing is, they kept the gulags going after he died.
So I heard. I think maybe from your book or from some other source. But yeah, the dark comedy of that film was quite remarkable. I thought they handled the material very well.
Yes.
It was deserving of that kind of treatment.
Yeah.
And the actors obviously had a blast doing it.
So we're left with irony. So I think if I'm, which is a blend of comic and the tragic, I suppose.
Yes.
And so I think I'm writing irony.
Yes.
I'm an ironist.
I see what you mean. Okay. Well, I was very touched by it, the details. I mean, I know my Solzhenitsyn, I know about this, but to be reminded of the details on a very personal level, like with your uncle in the letters, it's very sad and very touching.
Yeah, it's horrible what happened. So I don't spare any any of the ugliness that's occurred, and I don't try to sugarcoat it in any way.
Yes.
I just say what happened, and I also the funny stuff, the good stuff,
Yeah, sure.
And a lot of it is ironic, because I remember when we were kids, they used to prepare us in case of nuclear holocaust. We had to hide under the desks in our classroom.
Right.
And there was no way that was going to save us from a nuclear bomb.
Of course.
And we would poke fun at the kids that were in the aisle along the windows. We'd say, "You're going to die first." And we would bug them. And none of the kids wanted to sit in the aisle next to the windows, because they thought, well, the glass would burst in and they'd all get chopped up. And that was never going to happen. and then you're underneath your desk and you're looking at bubble gum and graffiti and junk that's stuck under the desk. I was just thinking that's a really great symbol for something that is as absurd and ridiculous as it's going to get, because here they think, well, I'm not sure if they were just trying to organize us in case of nuclear attack and then we would be properly orchestrated for death, or if they actually thought that we would be preserved if we hid under our desks, because then if the ceiling fell down, it wouldn't harm us. So I don't know. There's a lot of I don't know stuff that goes on in those books or in that history.
Yeah, I believe teachers and low-level bureaucrats in government might have been quite naive about the destructive power of nuclear bombs. Maybe they just didn't know about Nagasaki, or I know that the truth about the destruction in the Nagasaki thing was kept from the American people for quite a few years. They managed to, I wouldn't say sugarcoat it, but they managed to, keep it in the background for a number of years.
Yeah. So I guess what I was doing was I was creating an anti-war book.
Yes.
Among other things, you're just saying the war, the idea of war is preposterous. It's just like, why even do that? And I have indigenous friends who, the war didn't help them, and what happened in North America was just evil and horrible. And I look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, and it's very similar. We see occupations, illegal occupations of land and so on, and that's what happened to my parents' homeland too. And that's what happened to North American land that used to be indigenous. And so it's just the way of the world. It's not a pleasant world that we live in, but I figured, well, somebody's got to say it.
Right. Well, indeed. We have to always be reminded of the nightmare that we can choose to live in, or that we can't wake up from. Because look at Ukraine right now. It's nobody is, well, I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people are pleased about that. Yeah. I don't even think the Russian people are very pleased about it once they found out what was actually going on. No,
I mean the protests that are happening there are crazy right now, and so so they should be. But so what I try to do in this book is I just try to cover the kinds of ridiculousness that happen when totalitarian governments seize power and are oppressing people, and then people react and try to escape that. And so, like, how do you get away from it? And so you can misinterpret stuff. Like somebody told a friend of mine, a friend of a friend, that we will send a signal when you're in danger from the totalitarian police. And they said, well, what will be the signal? I said, we don't know, but you'll know what it is when you hear it. and they heard their window shutters opening and closing 3 times because there was a gust of wind that suddenly came up.
Yes.
And they thought,
that's the signal.
That's the warning. That's the signal. Let's get out of town. And they did, and they escaped, and they ended up on Pier 21. In Halifax, trying to get back, trying to get into Canada and away from their homeland. And it turned out that it was a false signal. It had nothing to do with their escaping, but it did have to do with the totalitarian police checking on whether or not one of the people that was going to supply the warnings, whether or not they were actually the person that was giving away the impending arrests. And it turned out that because somebody misinterpreted the sound of the shutters and they took off, this person was considered innocent because there was never a signal. So I just thought about that. I thought about the ridiculousness of that, and it's very ironic and very funny, and it includes life and death at the same time. And,
it
so
does.
That's the kind of angle that I'm looking at. Anyway.
And I also noticed another theme in the book that recurs in several stories is the presence of passing spirits, the presence of hungry ghosts, and various folk traditions that respect that sort of a thing. And I was intrigued that you chose to include all that.
Yes, well, I was looking at a history of people who had passed away and how they could be represented. And I noticed that there was a building in my neighborhood that had that was used to be a church, and it had a model of a church put out in front of it, and it was the same building. And so I thought, oh, there's a story in that. So I took that and I turned it into a story, and that was about the hungry ghosts that might end up wanting to get food somehow, because ghosts also have a certain type of hunger. It might not be for something of actual sustenance, but they do want something. And so I thought, well, let's write about. So it's a ghost story, and the story was crafted in such a way so that if a person becomes a ghost, they know where to go.
Very good.
They can go to that place that I described.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
The presence of spirits is certainly something that I've written about many times. So I'm always intrigued when others do. It's not always recognized or respected in our materialist, scientific, rationalist culture. So I'm always pleased to see it manifest.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I asked you
about it. Kind of a ghost story in a way. Very strange ghost story.
Well, I could go on praising this book, The Razor's Edge, for another hour. It's a marvelous book, and it's literature at the very highest level, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And combining the simplicity of childhood with the complexity of postmodern intellectual theory.
Yeah.
And it does it very well.
I try to do that flawlessly so that you don't even notice that the theory's embedded into the stories. I just tell the stories, and I used to teach that stuff. So
I mean, when Julia Kristeva makes her appearance in one of your stories, she comes charging out of a hotel elevator with a drink in her hand, which I find very amusing.
Yeah, she just waltzes out and says, I know that in Canada you're not allowed to drink wine in a public place, but I am Julia Kristeva.
I can do what I want.
So she waltzed up to me, and I had an interview lined up with her.
Yes.
And she conducted the interview very nicely.
Yes.
And but she's just like that, so I just went, okay, well that's going into the story.
Great, another entry into the literary sweepstakes. So I'm not sure if we're running out of time or not, but we might be. And on other interviews where I've run out of time and didn't know, it just sort of stops. And it's not horrible, but sometimes you get cut off in mid-sentence. So it's usually actually more amusing than horrible. But unless you have anything else that you'd like to add to what we've spoken about.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for the interview, and thank you for taking time to talk to me about it. That's all.
Well, a great pleasure on my part. Absolutely. Not a bead of sweat was cast in this. Pure joy, pure fun. We had a great afternoon together.
And I think Gordon Finn is doing wonderful stuff for literary Canada by mounting these live interviews on YouTube.
Well, thank you, Karl. Like I say, as I said before, we got started with Steve and Lawrence Hutchman, Bruce Mayer 3 years ago. We had some great fun, and then you know what happened after that. Yeah. So it's great. This is the first one in our new life. Yeah. And I'm happy you were able to organize it. Karl lives in Windsor, but he was in Toronto for a weekend conference, so we were able to set it up here in Oakville without too much sweat. And I'm so glad that we did it.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and all the best to the audience, and I hope you have a great year ahead.
Oh, yeah, well, these YouTube things seem to do quite well, especially if you put them on Facebook, then everybody finds out about it. So, goodbye to you guys and ladies, and goodbye to Karl.
Bye-bye.
Next time, friends, next
Thank you.
time.